It's really my pleasure and privilege to turn it over to you, Chiara, with the hope that Zizek can now share the screen with us and we'll have the presentation. And thank you once again to all of you for bearing with us despite the technical difficulties.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for this very flattering introduction. And I have to say that you are one of the few people who have introduced me using the right name and pronouncing my name the right way. So thank you very much. And yes, you talked about me trying to bring together different sort of bodies of scholarships and different apparently quite unrelated domain of studies and inquiry. And this is a little bit what I will be doing today with this talk, where I will be trying to sort of bring together two major strands of my current research. One is the research, my own research on the relationship between memory and heritage and ultranationalism, right-wing populism today, and the question of racism. And on the other hand, my work on the question of the colonial museums, colonial heritage, and decolonial activism in and around museums and cultural institutions. And I'm doing that not because, I just want to sort of give you an overview of my work at the moment, but because I think they are deeply interconnected. And indeed, the talk and the book that I'm trying to write now together with Wayne Modest is about trying to bring together the different sort of memory sites that are playing an important role in the current debates, not only on memory, but also on major political issues, and particularly the question of racism. Because I do think that, sort of memory and heritage play such an important role in the current debates and struggle around racism that we as memory and heritage scholars and cultural studies scholars can no longer sort of avoid looking into these connections. So in this talk, basically what I will be doing is to explore how the question of colonial memory, in particular colonial memory and heritage, intersect with contemporary political debates and struggles around a crucial issue of our time, namely the systemic racism that is structural in our societies in Europe and beyond, and that can be seen as a form of colonial heritage. This will be the thrust of my argument. And I will talk about racism as memory. That will be the first part of my talk today. And the second part, I will be talking of memory against racism, and particularly anti-colonial memory against racism. Now, can I have the first slides, please? The first slides. Right. Oh, sorry, I'm having again an issue that I don't see anything, maybe because I didn't approve the.
Could you see the screen that I just shared?
Yes.
Yes. Can you go back to the first? Yes. Okay. One moment. I'm still having some screen issues. Maybe it's my computer. Let me check. Okay, now it's looking better. So if you can just move to the first slide, please, the first IFD posters. Okay, thank you. It looks a bit better for me. I begin with several campaign posters put out by the far-right party Alternative for Germany, the AfD, in the lead up to the 2017 German elections, in which this new party astoundingly came third place. These images are notable in that they convey a racist, Islamophobic message by reference to native heritage and culture. Three white wine-sipping women in traditional Bavarian dress toast their preference for Burgundy wine and rejection of burqas. This is in the very center of the slide. Three more white women, and this is the next slide, please, in different German folkloric costumes, reject multiculturalism in the name of an internally diverse and yet coherent core German culture, which Germans are encouraged to commit to once again. Trau dich Deutschland, be daring Germany. Eating pork, this is on the previous slides, is presented as a key feature of this culture. Islam is presented as alien. As in the No Burqas for Bikini poster, an alleged defense of women's freedom is combined with traditional conservative misogyny around objectified and stereotypied female bodies. Orientalist imagery, and may I have the next slide, please? The 19th century painting, The Slave Market, depicting burdened Muslim slave traders bartering over naked white women, evokes the specter of Europe under Muslim domination, of Europe Islamization. Racism lurks in all these images, most prominently in that calling for white women to give birth to their own new Germans. And as many of you, those who know the German context, know that the term New Germans is commonly used for German citizens of foreign origins. So, and I've showed you these pics, these photos of these electoral posters, because I think they really foreground how issues of memory and heritage here are entangled with the kind of racism that is dominant today at the level of public discourse, and that we can call cultural racism. I shall return to this form of racism and to the ideological usurpation and manipulation of the female body in these images. For now, I want to draw your attention to a broader point, which is usually overlooked, namely right-wing populist reliance on ideas of heritage and memory. In particular, these posters vividly encapsulate how colonial memories linger on in the racist fabric of populist discourse. In this talk, I will scrutinize the populist claim that a shared homogeneous heritage and memory is key to a functioning political community, and that different heritages and cultures are incommensurable with one another. In so doing, I argue that to understand the relationship between memory and populism, we must foreground the question of race and cultural racism, which have been neglected in memory studies. It is crucial that we remedy this neglect, I argue, because cultural memories and heritage are now being used as a smokescreen for racism. That said, memory and heritage are also emerging as a key site for combating racism. In closing the talk, I will draw on another strand of research in which I focus together with Wayne Modest on how decolonial activists and artists are contesting racism by engaging with colonial heritage in new and creative ways. By activating colonial memory sites and the mobilization of a kind of anti-colonial mnemonics, by an art of anti-colonial memory. Contemporary right-wing ideologies stress sociocultural as opposed to socioeconomic issues, promoting forms of ethno-nationalism and civilizationism that are rooted in myth of the past. Despite this emphasis on cultural heritage and the many ways in which the past homes populist discourse, these issues are not being talked about, particularly by scholars in memory and heritage. Scholars in this field have only recently begun to explore the relationship between the subject matter, our subject matter, and the momentous rise or return for some of ultranationalism, or what Enzo Traverso calls post-fascism. Where the topic is broached, it is usually framed in terms of this force's relationship with the fascist past, with the classical age of fascism, as it were, in the early and mid-20th century. Indeed, much debate has focused on the extent to which today's right-wing populism resembles historical fascism. I tend to believe that history does not repeat itself, but rather kinds, that there may be a strong ideological and genealogical link, but far-right populism is not the same as fascism. So the far-right populism of today is not the same as fascism of the first half of the 20th century. There are obvious dangers in today's political developments, especially, as I shall explain, how certain fascist ideas are freely circulating and being adopted in broader society. What is more, I recognize that mobilizing the label of fascism has the advantage of ringing alarm bells and awaken those who might otherwise accept some of these ideas. All that said, I'm afraid that emphasizing the question of whether what we have today is fascism risks obscuring a key dimension of contemporary far right-wing populism, which is deeply intertwined with memory, and particular colonial memories. I'm speaking here about racism, and specifically cultural racism, as some have termed what they see as a new variant of the social phenomenon. And this will be the focus of my talk today, because indeed, the question of racism is also what connects uses of memory that reproduce colonial durabilities, to use Anne Stoller language, and uses of mobilization of memory that actually work to sort of counter those colonial durabilities. To my knowledge, there has been little direct engagement with the question of race and racism in memory and heritage studies. I find this paradoxical, given the Holocaust's central role in the memory boom and the spread of the politics of regrets, and of memory studies as a field in general. Indeed, even scholars of the Holocaust who have substantially engaged with colonialism, such as Michael Rothberg, they have not explicitly addressed, until recently, the relationship between memory and race or racism. This is also paradoxical, because if memory studies may not have addressed the relationship between memory and racism, other scholars working in other disciplinary fields have long made the connection. But, and this is another paradox, without engaging with the rich body of theories and concepts developed by memory studies. I'm talking here about critical race theory and Black studies, vibrant fields today that have emerged as particularly valuable means of excavating the current conjuncture of declining democracy worldwide. Scholars in the fields have consistently theorized racism as a form of colonial memory. Theories such as Anne Stoller, Gloria Wecker, Saidiya Hartman, and Christina Sharp, to name but a few, have explained racism in terms of colonial durabilities and aphasia, a long-standing cultural archives or slavery afterlives in the present. And now I just want to read out a few quotes of those critical race theories and Black studies scholars who essentially define, or better talk about, racism as a form of memory. Saidiya Hartman, for example, she talks about racism as, and here I'm quoting her, afterlife of slavery, which produces skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment, end of quote. Gloria Wecker, instead, referring to Edward Said, she talks about racism as, and here I'm quoting Gloria Wecker from her book White Innocence of 2016. So for Gloria Wecker, racism is a cultural archive that has influenced historical cultural configuration and current dominant and cherished self-representation, a storehouse of a particular knowledge and structures of attitude and reference, end of quote. I've already mentioned Hans Stoller's ideas of colonial durabilities in the present and colonial duress in the present. And I want to end this list of definitions of racism by critical race theories referring to memory with the words of Christina Sharp out of her book, Living in the Wake of Slavery. For Sharp, to be in the wake is to occupy and to be occupied by the continuous and changing present of slaveries as yet unresolved unfolding. And to perform wake work is to labor within the spaces of paradoxes surrounding Black citizenship, identity, and racism. So you can see how, on the one hand, again, racism is theorized as a form of memory, and as a form of memory that, like memory, completely problematize the relationship between the past, present, and future that is very much sort of our own implicit frame of reference within a modernist timeline. This said, I want to sort of develop this, this idea of, in the first part of my talk, which I'm gonna start now, I'm gonna develop this idea of memory, of racism as a form of memory, and racism as a form of sort of unreckoning with the implicit sort of colonial memories that imbue our present and our everyday life. So in this first part of the talk, I will look at how heritage can function in racism and often a screen for racism. I claim that racism is constituted by layers of memory, and above all colonial memory, and might itself be seen as a form of colonial memory along the lines and following the inspiration of critical race theorists. My engagement with the topic draws on around 100 interviews with supporters of populist parties across Europe. These interviews were carried out by sociologists, by my colleague, sociologist Ayaan Kaya and his team in 2017 as part of the Cohere 2020 of the Cohere project, which has investigated dynamics of European identity formation and appropriations of the idea of a shared European memory and heritage. And if I can have the next slide. Oh yes, sorry. This is the title of the first section, and this is the book that Ayaan and I have co-edited, and that includes some of the reflections that I will discuss in this first part of the talk. And may I have the next slide? Thank you. So contemporary right-wing populist discourse mobilizes what social scientists have called new racism or cultural racism. This racism originates in the older 19th century racism of eugenics, but departs from it in that the basis of discrimination is cultural rather than biological, at least explicitly. By foregrounding culture, proponents of cultural racism can combine their ideology with liberal, even European values, like the sort of feminism we have seen in the AfD posters. With older notions of biologically based racial hierarchies being discredited due to their association with Nazism, this new form of racism in disguise emphasizes the incompatibility of different heritages and values. As Martin Barker put it, this form of racism, and here I'm quoting him, is concealed inside apparently innocent language about culture, end of quote, and heritage, I would add. The basic idea underlying this new racism and much contemporary populist discourse is that functioning political communities are based on solid ethno-religious cultural peoples with a solid shared cultural heritage and historical memory. This outlook conflates nation identity, culture, memory, heritage, and territory. Tangible, homogeneous cultures rooted in the past, cultural heritage, are taken as the key markers of groups of people and their worth. This serves to fix people in place according to the heritage to which they belong, establishing a seemingly unbridgeable gulf between incompatible heritages. Now, I won't talk too much about it, about the question of so-called femonationalism and the sort of the feminist dimension of this kind of racism. But I just want to mention that, you know, a kind of femonationalism, so to speak, which appears all over the queer interviews, as it does in the AfD posters above. I remind you of the no burqas but bikinis image. And so white German or European ways of life, which allegedly protect women's freedom, are contrasted with gender oppression presented as an inevitable feature of an archaic Islamic civilization, which is impermeable to change and untouched by history. In this way, an emancipatory argument championing freedom and human rights is used to advance a discriminatory agenda. This move is legitimized by an underlying and surely racialized cultural conception of politics, which view politics as the outcome of deep-rooted cultures, of heritages. Commentators have highlighted how this discourse recalls older forms of colonial feminism and cultural representations enlisting female oppression in the cause of empire. So the classic colonial trope of white men saving brown women from brown women from brown men. This is a phrasing by Gayatri Spivak, which you clearly see, if you remember that, in the image about the burkini and also about the slave market and Muslim slave traders enslaving a white woman. Can femonationalism then be seen as a form of memory? What kind of memory is this palimpsest of racist images, this deep-rooted recursive repertoire? In addressing these questions, I first discussed the politicized understanding of heritage at stake in the queer interviews' critique of what they perceive as hegemonic multiculturalism. Second, I explored the colonial genealogies of a number of tropes that are mobilized in the interviews, through which I indicate the value of viewing racism as a form of implicit memory. May I have the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. With remarkable, so now I will go into this cultural conception of politics that is very much part of right-wing populist discourse, but that sort of has spilled over into broader political discourse. With remarkable consistency, the vast majority of the queer interviews uphold the belief that healthy, functioning political communities are grounded in a shared homogeneous heritage and historical memory, and that deep-rooted cultural and historical differences inevitably cause divisions and conflict. This conception of heritage is woven into a recurring trope in the interviews, the critique of multiculturalism. Most interviewees articulate a strong sense of national and European belonging, which they see as threatened by disappearance or replacement brought on by migration and multicultural policies. Examples abound in our interviews. Consider the following quotation, and here I'm quoting the PVV, that's the Partij for Freedom, the Dutch right-wing, one of the Dutch right-wing populist parties, the now longest existing. It would be a sincere waste if our own culture, inclusive celebrations like Black Pete, will disappear due to the pressure of other foreign cultures. Just because they, immigrant and minorities, don't assimilate to the Dutch norms and values that have been living here for centuries. I think that the history, norms, and values of the Netherlands should not be pressed down by another culture and foreign culture. This quotation puts the cultural theory, or rather the cultural conception of politics on which I'm focusing here, in a nutshell, and indicates 5 of its constitutive elements. 1, a civilizational understanding of culture as cultural heritage rooted in national or European territory. The norms and values that have been living here for centuries. So this interview really gives this sense of sort of culture being sort of rooted and having lived like people in a place like the Netherlands for centuries. 2, the perceived inevitability that different cultures and civilizations will clash with one another. And this, I don't have time to go into this. You might sort of, what I just said might resonate with the theories of Samuel Huntington, but I just want to briefly mention that this idea of cultures being incommensurable and being different, and yet again not able to live with each other, is very much the sort of the result of a trickling down into the public sphere and popular culture, so to speak, of ideas which are connected with the sort of intellectual new far right of the 1990s, 1980s, 1990s, and 2000, and with a series of intellectuals who have theorized multiculturalism from a right-wing point of view, and grounding it in this idea that cultures are important, are central to people's lives, but in order to do so, they have to be kept separate. So 3 third elements of this cultural conception of politics that is foregrounded here. Threats coming from foreign culture. There are threats coming from foreign cultures that we should, be scared of those. 4, fears of cultural disappearance and replacement. And 5, the colonial memories and cultural imaginaries underpinning these organic theories. Tellingly, this respondence refers to an infamous object of colonial heritage, Black Pete, the blackface character that has traditionally accompanied the Dutch version of Santa Claus. Originating in the 19th century, this racist caricature, which resembles the stereotypical racist image of enslaved Africans, has become a matter of intense public debates in the Netherlands in the last decade and the target of much decolonial activism. Discussions around Black Pete have become a central platform for debating the pervasive racism in Dutch society more generally. Typically, this respondent, like many others like him, consider Black Pete an icon of Dutch cultural heritage of Dutch memory to be preserved. In denying that this figure is racist, they invoke cultural heritage, claiming that Black Pete has been passed down from former generations and therefore is not racist. Supporters of the far-right Party for Freedom, like the person who said the words you see in the slide, and others have vehemently defended their attachment to this colonial tradition, rejecting accusation of racism by claiming that this is part of our heritage. And as if heritage cannot be racist and cannot be changed. So here you see how the claim of heritage, Black Pete is not racist because, and we have to keep him because it's our heritage. So this claim of heritage functions to close down any possible discussion. heritage is taken to be immutable and unchanging and to be cherished at all cost. And in this way, Black Pete illustrates a wider trend whereby the discourse of heritage is mobilized to whitewash racism. And here I want to point out how this idea of, Black Pete not being racist because it's heritage and racist caricature in our popular culture not having to be changed because they are heritage is an argument that is being made not only by sort of the right-wing populist, but by broader section of the population. At the beginning, now things have changed in the Netherlands in the last 10 years, but until 5 years ago, most people would tell you, non-Black people in the Netherlands would tell you, Black Pete is our heritage and we don't want to change it. Even, very liberal left-wing. And the Prime Minister has advanced until recently this argument quite often. So this is again, this idea of sort of heritage as a screen and as whitewashing racism and legitimating racism is sort of a trick and a discourse that is very much sort of widespread in Dutch society. May I have the next slide, please? Yes. Oh. Another quote from the interview, the Cohere interviews with populist supporters. The example of Black Pete, and which helps me emphasize the dimension of colonial memory, the sort of racism as a layered sort of history, as a layered set of sedimentation of narratives and images. The example of Black Pete also clearly shows the extent to which this cultural conception of politics, according to which each discrete people has its own integral, immutable heritage, is imbued with colonial memories. These memories reverberate in manifold and at times surprising ways across the Cohere interviews. For example, in this quote from a French respondent who is a Le Pen supporter. What is amazing is that all the North African countries which were colonized by us, by the French, we find it so good that they expelled us, okay? For which reason did they do that? We brought to them a lot of things, but they expelled us because we were a foreign culture, which didn't suit them and which was not their culture, okay? So they did not like foreign French culture in their territory, but they impose us a North African culture in our territory. I would like to know why there is a two-tier system here. In this quotation, a lingering colonial nostalgia and sense of currently diminished but never forgotten European superiority intersects with dismay at an ongoing process of reverse colonialism. So you can see how here and elsewhere in our interviews, the colonial past appears to afford a silent archive, readily available and yet camouflaged, a subliminal repertoire of images, narratives, scripted actions that sound like obvious, with which to interpret and act upon the present is like a sort of a common sense frame. Conversely, the contemporary discourse of cultural fundamentalism informs how the colonial past is mobilized and refashioned, producing in this case a bizarre culturalized theory of decolonization. So these reinterpretations and reinscriptions of the past may indeed follow curious paths, though often depoliticizing ones. In the case of this quote, you see how at one level, the respondents wheel out the tired trope of colonialism bringing modernity to allegedly non-modern societies. At another, they put forward a high historical reduction of anti-colonialism to the struggle against a foreign culture. This culturalization of colonialism and power relations more broadly conveniently obscures their realities, exploitation and domination, along with history. There is also a new identity politics. Today's relations are seen as inversions of the role of colonizer and colonized, The colonial past being used to steer deep emotions and principally a fear of disappearance and extinction, and motivate and justify behavior in the present. Can I have the next slide? I wanted to show you an image that typify and exemplify what I'm talking about, the reverse role of colonizer and colonized. For those of you who do not know him, this is the leader, Matteo Salvini, the leader of the Lega, one of the largest party in Italy, one of the largest party in Italy at the moment, and of the right-wing populist Lega, and which has used in several occasions and in several elections this image of Native Americans to emphasize how they have been wiped out by the colonizers, and this is what we, sort of white Italians, are risking at the moment, to be wiped out, to be replaced by sort of the new sort of colonizers. Now, how much time do I still have? A little bit lost time of...
We started a bit late, so I think if everyone is comfortable, you should feel at liberty to speak as long as you like, but maybe 15, 20 minutes.
Oh, yes, I will be done before 15. That's okay. So if the long memory of colonialism resounds through the interviews, a number of interviewees stress that they are not racist and that racism is a thing of the past. We talk about culture, about heritage, they insist, not race. Clearly, this argument does not hold. They mobilize cultural arguments around heritage and attacks on values. This idea of attacks on values also comes back in all those interviews and has also been voiced in many occasions by our Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, the idea of, immigrants contesting Dutch values. And sort of these arguments about attacking values usually justifies, like in right-wing populist discourse, calling for people's expulsions as aliens. Interviewee claim to view different cultures and peoples as separate but equal. And again, this is in line with right-wing theorists of right-wing multiculturalism or ethnopluralism. In actuality, however, their responses are replete with references to hierarchies among cultures. So very often in our interviewees say, is not a matter of race, we are culturally different and therefore we should be separate. And yet, and cultures are all equal, but at the same time, often within the same quote, these interviewees create implicit and at times not so implicit hierarchies between cultures, among cultures. Also, the boundaries between culture and race are constantly blurred and renegotiated. One respondent, for example, refers to racial psychologists that are almost but not quite inbred, the product of deep roots and long-standing histories. Blacks and Arabs, this is the racial slur that the openly racist interviewees have used, are sometimes, and not only in one interviews, said to be culturally different, but also to have a lower IQ. So this shows how this cultural fundamentalism, this belief in the fundamental, role of culture in politics and the essentialist nature of culture, reveals itself here as cultural racism in disguise. The interviews expose the discursive trick achieved through a slippage between culture and race that allows racism to be accepted into the mainstream and racists to feel free and righteous. Racism is legitimized under the mantle of a cultural theory of politics, which erects insurmountable gaps between heritages and proposes an impossible cultural homogeneity as the cure to contemporary sociopolitical malaise. This cultural racism, then, is not only deeply entangled with collective memory, but can be seen as a form of memory itself, even if tacit and barely articulated, aphasic, but also very material in its manifestation. How helpful it is to consider racism as deep-rooted implicit cultural memory, which scripts the thoughts and actions of many people, even beyond the far right. At one level, doing so, I argue that it reveals how the new form of racism that I have been describing fundamentally relies on a subtly racialized conception of heritage as the foundation of a healthy political community, binding people of the same heritage together. And this is why mixing does not work. This is another quote from our interviews, because heritages are distinct and incommensurable. This cultural fundamentalism is both new and old in that it reproduces certain cultural memories, reinscripting a repertoire of images and narratives that are ultimately rooted in the colonial period and in racist taxonomies. At another level, to think racism as memory forces one to think of memories differently, beyond the lieu et milieu de mémoire dichotomy. Indeed, racism as cultural memory is both milieu and lieu de mémoire. It is taken for granted, embedded in, and reproduced by informal everyday sociality, chats, ritualized behaviors. Yet it is simultaneously cultivated and institutionalized too, the product of both hard and soft memory institutions. It has very material differential effects on bodies and people and remains a collection of discursive ideas and immaterial narratives, which then imbue and inscribe themselves upon bodies and institutions. This duality seems to mark the endurance of colonial memory, which are both incredibly persistent and tenacious and contingent, transforming in each new historical conjuncture. So it seems to me that thinking racism as memory forces us to reflect on memories as simultaneously embodied as skin, so to speak, and institutionalized at the same time, both very intimate and very, very intimate, very spontaneous, and very institutionalized at the same time. Now, these are difficult times for academia at large and the humanities in particular, which are viewed with suspicions by politics and policymakers and plagued by never-ending budget cuts, and now by the coronavirus. But we have been perhaps too self-absorbed, too paralyzed by the positivist idea that engaging with current political issues like racism might undermine our scholarly integrity. But given the far-right populists, are rapaciously misusing history and hijacking our very concepts like memory and heritage, it is high time, I believe, that we make our voices heard more loudly. And I just want to emphasize how very often it's, right-wing populists use this idea of heritage as sort of heritage as something that is to be cherished and deeply embedded in sort of human cultures, that we cannot live with it and that we have to sort of keep on cherishing it. Now, may I have the next slide, please? Okay, this is some more quotes that I have briefly mentioned in my discussion so far. May I have we can come back in the discussion of this, the interviewers talking about culture as heritage that is something that creates gaps between people, and how this justifies and is a screen for racism. Now, in my second, and this is more like a coda than a second section of my talk, I want to talk about memory against racism, which is an equally important site of public debates today. So I want to emphasize that although discourses of memory and heritages have become enmeshed with the rise of the populist new right, and the mainstreaming of ideas of the populist new right, they are also being put to other fundamentally different purposes. In particular, I want to briefly reflect on the place of memory and memory work. And I remind you of Christina Sharp's idea of way work in decolonial and anti-racist struggles. Drawing on a book that I'm in the process of writing with Wayne Modest of the National Museum of World Cultures. Recent years have seen the emergence of a range of movements and initiatives concerned to reveal and contest colonialism's many afterlives in cultural institutions, political processes, and society at large. From Black Lives Matter and The Roads Must Fall to Decolonize This Place, Berlin Postcolonial, and Decolonize the museums in the Netherlands, and also the movement contesting the figure of Black Pete, for example. Can I have the next slides? I just wanted to show you a few examples, a few picks out of these various movements. Here you see in this first slide, activists of the Road Must Fall movement in South Africa celebrating together with other students and other people when the statue of Cecil Rhodes was taken down from the University of Cape Town. And you see the banners, people saying this is more than a statue. And in the background, this is the beginning. Can I have the next slide, please? This is very familiar to all of you. We see that, you know, following up on the sort of the waves created on the one hand by the Roads Must Fall movement originating in South Africa, and that then later spread to Oxford and other universities, and the Black Lives Matter protests in the US. We have had a series of contestations in European public spaces surrounding statues of slave traders and other colonial figures. And here probably the most iconic one, when activists in Bristol pulled down the statue of slave trader Edward Colston and threw it in the river. Another image, this is very well known to people in Germany. The activists in Germany have contested the showcasing of colonial collections in the center of Berlin, in the new iconic major national museum, the Humboldt Forum, sparking a nationwide debate about the legacy of German colonialism in the present. And the final slide, which I end, that I think it's a nice also sort of background and framing for our discussion. I don't know, some of you might not know who this person is perhaps less well known than the activist who pulled down the statue of Edward Colston. This is Mosulu Di Abanza, a Pan-African activist who in 2020 entered a number of European ethnographic museums, the Quai Branly, the Museum, and the Ethnographic Museum in the Netherlands in Bergendal, and performatively stole a piece of African heritage, claiming to return it to its rightful owners in Africa. And again, this was very much of a performance, because he entered the museum, live streamed everything on Facebook, went out and went to search for the police to get arrested, to kind of make this point that, you know, he is seen as somebody stealing, and he was also accused of stealing. But in fact, you know, those who are stealing the statue might be the people in the museum, because this is likely to be a looted cultural artifact. So part of what makes this social movement stand out is how they connect racism with memory and heritage. In underlining the necessity of reckoning with the colonial, activists have focused explicitly on monuments and cultural institutions of memory that reproduce dominant narratives of colonialism and oppressive cultural heritages. In targeting museums, they have prompted French President Emmanuel Macron to call for a return of African cultural artifacts held in French and European museums to Africa, along with similar restitutions plans elsewhere. In targeting public monuments, activists have spectacularly toppled statues of colonial figures in former metropolis and colonies across the world. Minority activists, artists, and scholars have played a key role in this project of making visible the colonial foundations of the present. These actions constitute disruptive acts of memory, pointed interventions in hegemonic histories of the colonial past in which contemporary racisms are grounded. The aim is not simply to return these museum objects or remove that statue, important though this may be, but through these interventions to tackle underlying social problems of racism and structural exclusions, far too often hidden from view. So this activism involves making the structural issues visible in their everydayness, revealing the presence of colonial memories of colonial heritage in our public and private spaces in all the pervasive banality. Notion of heritage and cultural memory may have been appropriated in the contemporary resurgence of racism and ultranationalism, but they remain unstable and open to challenge. There are other claimants to colonial history, not least the colonial movements, which are all too conscious of the urgency of contesting memory in the ongoing global struggle against racism. And here I end with apologies for the problems with the PowerPoint and my screen, and for being perhaps a little long. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Chiara. Zizek, perhaps we can maintain the PowerPoint in the possibility that the discussion might involve it. I don't know what you think, Chiara, or we can bring it back if need be. Thank you so much for this wide-ranging and fruitful presentation, and thank you for bearing with us as well yourself, Chiara, through all of these technical difficulties. I was particularly struck by the strange, almost uncanny way in which this cultural racism you discuss blends and braids, on the one hand, illiberal arguments for what are taken to be liberal values, such as the sort of, particularly this sort of femo-nationalism that you discuss. And on the other hand, liberal arguments for illiberal values. It's very strange, and perhaps that gets to some of the specificity of it. I'm also sort of curious about the role of collective amnesia vis-a-vis collective memory as a form of racism, particularly in metropolitan places. I think oftentimes we're sort of more keen or sort of intuitively think of sort of the denial of the crimes of the past as formations of racism in the present. So there's that kind of dynamic as well. But those are just a few off of the cuff comments from me. I think we have ample time for some discussion. I suggest that we at least go until 6:45, if that's okay with you, Chiara. I don't know, 6:30 I think is when we're set to end typically, but if you have a comment or question, please raise your digital hand since we are a large number, and that way I'll be able to see who is in the queue. And I believe Banu is now in the queue. Please unmute yourself when you want to speak, and Buyurun.
Thank you so much, Chiara. Thank you so much for sharing this so exciting research with us, and so lovely to see you and hear more about this ongoing work. I was wondering, and forgive me if my question is not as well formed, and me jumping in is owed to my excitement about the project, really. But you, of course, brought up something that people like myself who've worked on feminist memory have been asking ourselves for a long time, because we often think about it exactly like you laid it out in the beginning of your paper, in terms of a mobilization towards hopefully more progressive ends, and now find ourselves increasingly in this predicament that you described. And where I always wonder, is it about an appropriation, like we've seen it, for instance, in the freedom of expression discourse, which has been vacated by the left, for instance, and has been increasingly taken up by populist movements, especially in Europe, but also in the US. So my question is a little bit, if you would be willing to walk us in some more detail, or even if you just reiterate some of your arguments in terms of, I understand it makes a lot of sense to talk about racism as memory, but at the same time, I wonder if every recourse to the past is indeed an operation of memory. And I'm not saying this to reinforce the problematic distinction between memory and history, which memory studies has been trying to so painfully dismantle. And yet I wonder if the register of recall in populist movements and stances really works as memory, or if you see it more as this kind of recuperation for populist, for neo or fascist right-wing causes. I would love to hear a little bit more about how you guys and you are thinking about this in your work when you sort of pull it apart. Thank you so much.
Shall I answer, or you want to collect more questions? Shall I answer?
I think for the moment we can go one by one, and if we have one more question or comment in the queue. So for now, I think, yeah, go ahead, Chiara.
Well, thank you, Banu. Hi, nice to see you. Glad to see you after a long time. Hope to see you soon again in person. This pandemic really keeping us apart, and people we really like to talk to. And thank you for your question. In a way, I agree with you. I think there is a question which I have also sort of suggested here and there of, asking ourselves whether it makes sense to talk about racism in terms of memory. I do believe there are reasons to do so. First of all, because, people sort of, the scholars of race talk about, they don't often use the term memory. They talk about afterlives, they talk about durabilities, they talk about archive. They talk a lot about archive. Actually, indeed, they use all kinds of concepts which are related to memory. And indeed, I do think very often they talk about something that I would call memory. And in that sense, I think it's important for us to ask ourselves, first of all, why it is that memory and heritage study, well, heritage studies is slightly different, but memory studies in particular has completely sort of ignored the issue of race. And whether or not there is what is sort of the analytical purchase of talking about racism and memories together. I mean, I think there is some analytical purchase also because, for example, by doing so, I think you gain on the one hand a sort of a very interesting notion of memory, which is very complicated, which is beyond sort of all the dichotomies that, we in memory studies have been trained into, sort of the classics, the stuff that you teach in memory studies for dummies, communicative and cultural and lieu and milieu, and now there are knots and this and multidirectionality. So because it's really a complex form of memory. And on the other hand, because I think by seeing sort of race and memory together, you really see how the question of, in a way, I would say would be a way for scholar to take seriously and to activist message that in order to act upon the present and the future, we need to revisit this past. And I think sort of, activist message is loud and clear. But for me, it is an open question. And I've sort of, and perhaps something that we can talk about, and because indeed there are also, because what I find fascinating in the interviews is this, again, this sort of semi-conscious repertoire of ideas, narratives that really seems like something like, you know, Nora's milieu of memory, or, you know, Assmann communicative memory, the stuff that you know, sort of is a little bit your common sense, and the stuff that you have learned, the kind of bits and pieces of history that you have learned throughout your life and in public cultures, in mostly not in school, but more in public cultures, but that frame your own understanding of the present. And for example, in the encounter of these people with what they call immigrant, which is who are very often sort of fellow Europeans, in framing sort of their understanding of, for example, multiculturalism.
Thank you so much, Chiara. I think this is a really quite productive topic that we might continue on. I'm reminded of this somewhat famous passage now from Anne Stoller in Duress, Imperial Durabilities in Our Time, where she critiques the concept of memory as insufficient for accounting for the sort of pressure of the past on the present. And I tend to agree with you that perhaps there was something lost in that move against memory there, which was coming from a scholar, of course, in Anne Stoller's case, outside of what the sort of key debates in memory studies, perhaps. So there's more to discuss here, but we have at least 3 more comments. Karin, please. Unmute yourself.
I was saying hi, we haven't met before. I'm a colleague of Jeremy at the MPI. I know nothing about memory studies, but I used to be an historian in a past life. I was also wondering in a similar way, maybe as the previous speaker, about what exactly you want to emphasize so much when you say racism as memory, because I mean, obviously, kind of maybe all movements or all conceptions of social life refer in some way to history and to predecessors, a tradition. Yeah, progressive movements do that as well. I mean, socialism would, feminism does. We all do that. And of course, it's peculiar to right-wing ideas, nationalism, that tradition, yeah, national life, consistency, etc., is a core element. So what exactly do you see as peculiar in principle? Of course, the content of racism is different, but that I didn't quite get. And the second bit is that I was wondering whether it is right to focus so much on memories of slavery and colonialism as the core element, because if I think of racist ideas in the German tradition from the late 19th century, I think it was, well, at the forefront often the yellow peril. Then it was the Turkish danger, the Ottomans taking over Christian Europe. Yeah. Various ideas, of course, about Jews, but colonialism itself, I don't see it as so central necessarily. And the idea of immigrants as a colonization, I would relate this more to the always core idea of the extreme right that the national survival is under threat in some way. Yeah, I would see it as a feature or a version of that. So maybe we narrow our understanding down too much or base it too much on American ideas of racism if we focus so centrally on slavery and colonialism alone.
Okay. I would say, first of all, I just want to, specify, first of all, one thing is slavery and one thing is colonialism, which is, of course, slavery is a very important part of colonialism, but colonialism is also, is also a lot more. For example, in the German case, sort of the debate on slavery, it's relatively, so the debate is about sort of 19th century colonialism and particularly the Herero-Nama genocide. So slavery is sort of one part of the question. I work a little bit more with slavery now because I work with Dutch museums, and of course in the Netherlands the question of slavery is a sort of fundamental question of national history and political memory and political culture. But you know, one thing, slavery is one aspect of the question of sort of decolonial in the present. The point that I wanted to make now, I'm just going to try to sort of summarize it and boil it down to the core. One, that right-wing populists rely tremendously on, more than others, on issues of memory and heritage. Why? Because right-wing populist idea are basically a form of extreme ethno-nationalism that believes that a functioning political community has to be grounded in a shared cultural heritage. So it's a shared culture, but it's not only culture, it has deep roots, it has history, it's deeply rooted. So it's not, I would say it's cultural heritage rather than culture, because cultural heritage gives this sense of deep roots, which comes back in the interviews with our supporters, which is a very specific conception of politics. I personally, and don't believe that the political community is grounded in sort of, for various reasons, I don't believe that a functioning political community should be funded or is funded on a homogeneous cultural heritage. But this is central to the ideology and the discourse of right-wing populists. So my first message is, we in memory and heritage studies should really reflect on how a major political force in our times is using, sort of centering on our very central notions. And again, I think this is particularly this idea of cultural heritage is, for example, very strong in the Netherlands and has been used as a way to say, no, we don't change our racist traditions because this is our heritage. So heritage works at a number of different levels, both as foundation of political communities and as legitimation for people to say, I'm not racist because I'm talking about cultural heritage. So this is one. And the other element is that racism is memory in the sense, I mean, in that sense, I am heavily drawing on American, but not only American and Dutch critical race theory, because, also Gloria Weckers belongs to makes a very similar argument that racism is not just, it's about a repertoire, an archive. So it's about a frame of mind that is the product of these common sense memories that we carry in our heads, which means images, narratives, this idea of the tropes. For example, you see people in this small village see the image of the slave market and they think, oh yes, so it resonates with the old colonial tropes, the idea of, white men saving brown women from brown men. So it's something, it's easy to interpret those images, those encounters through this repertoire. So these are the two arguments that I make. And I think they are specific to, right-wing populism as specific to contemporary activism, targeting sites of memory. It's not, people have a I don't think that activists in the past have always focused their attentions on site of memory. I think the questions of memory are really deeply tied to some of the core political debates and issues of our present. And I'm only saying that I think we should, as heritage and memories. And I consider myself rather a sort of cultural studies person, but I do a lot of memory and heritage studies. And I think we should sort of face that. And I'm sorry for being long.
Not
I
at
hope
all.
that
Not at
answers
all,
your question.
Chiara. I think in the interest of time, we should probably bundle questions and comments now. So maybe we'll take two. I see Robin and Chichek, and then we have one more following that, if that's okay with you.
Yes, thank you very much. And also thank you for your great talk. I really enjoyed it. And I also enjoyed the focus, at least in the beginning, on the visual material you showed. And now I tried to be short. It's a bit of a convoluted question, or I rather invite you to maybe connect what you have talked about today to another issue that I've been looking at recently, and that is how the concept of cultural appropriation became a boogeyman in far-right discourse. So similar to, for example, critical race theory, if you look at American, that is from the United States of America, commentators or right-wing media figures, oftentimes when they would point allegedly towards where the left has gone too far or where it is trying to curb cultural identity and stuff like that, they would often point towards critical race theory and to cultural appropriation. So I would be interested what your thoughts are coming from this perspective on cultural racism, on the concept of cultural appropriation, and how using it as a boogeyman plays into what is currently happening in far-right discourse in Europe with regards to cultural racism. So I'm very sorry, it's a bit convoluted, but I would simply be interested on your thoughts on that. And it's rather an invitation of thinking out aloud, I guess. So thank you very much.
Chichek, perhaps you can join in now as well.
Thank you, Chiara, for this wonderful talk. I'm particularly moved by your analysis where you bring the milieu and the lieu together in your framing of racism as memory. And I was wondering how you place the museum in this analysis. So,
sorry, I lost you. How do I place the
museum as an actor in this analysis? So you only refer to the museum in the counter examples in the second part of your presentation, and I wonder how you analyze the role of the museum in the production of racism as memory. I ask this with the hope that maybe it helps us clarifying also the contribution of memory as racism to the debates on durability, duress, afterlife, and the archive. Thank you.
Okay, then I'll try to answer these two questions. I mean, I don't know if I can do it quickly. I mean, the first question, it's very difficult for me to sort of answer in a short way because it's really a major issue. I mean, culture and cultural heritage in particular are really at the core of sort of what I do see as a current rather hegemonic cultural conception of politics that goes well beyond you can connect it to sort of identity politics, and it's certainly connected to identity politics. But what I see now is a tendency that, again, is also it goes across the political lines, is rather dominant in public discourse, particularly in Europe, to give cultural explanations to socio-political issues. Now, I don't want to be sort of Marxist in the sense of let's go back to the old style sort of structure and superstructure and the economy influences culture, because as a cultural studies person, I do believe that culture is deeply intertwined with politics. But at the same time, I think what is, circulating at the moment is a kind of cultural, is a very banal cultural essentialism that is extremely problematic. I mean, of course, and then the references, and here I think it's particularly interesting that, and I think there is a little bit of an issue, because very often the theoretical and academic point of reference for this implicit and explicit for this cultural theory of politics that are circulating today are either fascist or certain kinds of academics. I mean, the most famous one and the most liberal is, of course, Samuel Huntington. But there is also a long tradition that tends to be there is a long tradition of really right-wing thinking, fascist thinking around this idea of ethnopluralism that are actually disseminated in our public sphere without us really knowing it. And of course, then the war on terror and Samuel Huntington played also a major role in circulating this these arguments. And at the same time, it's like the question of cultural appropriation, the accusations of cultural appropriations, the accusations of cultural Marxism. This is also working with museums that are trying to do something with the colonial legacies that are with their own colonial legacies and colonial collections. I see that accusations very often coming from certain sectors of public opinion of them being leftist institutions and trying to do being biased, cultural Marxist institutions, leftist institutions, buying in and being controlled by the activist. So I mean, I think those debates are part of this cultural conception and cultural practice of politics, which should make us, at least myself and us as cultural studies scholar, memory studies and heritage studies scholars, way more aware of the ways in which our terms, our concepts are being appropriated in complex ways, because I do think, as you mentioned, I mean, the battles are very complex, as is the the reinscriptions of colonial memories into the present is not, there are complex ways in which this memory is entangled with the political present. And concerning museums, I mean, it's curious because I work a lot with museums, so it's indeed, I didn't talk too much about the museums, even though this is what I'm doing now most of the time. And it's, in the case of museums now, certainly they are at the heart of this debate on colonial heritage, the colonial legacies in the present. And I would argue usually what happens is, like in the case of the Humboldt Forum, there is because museums are deeply entangled in the colonial legacy. The museums are profoundly colonial institutions, a bit like anthropology. I see them in parallel with the discipline of anthropology. They are profoundly colonial institutions, and particularly ethnographic museums, and not being able anymore to to avoid facing the colonial legacy. Now they are turning into interesting places to think about those issues. I think it's mostly, so it comes from very often the activists outside, like in the case of the Humboldt Forum, they say, hey, this is not possible. These representations that you communicate of our nations, of our communities, are skewed. There are only some people in this heritage and not others. And this is a problem of recognition and healthy democracy. And then the museum have one way or the other to respond to that. And they are responding more so in certain places. And I think they are transforming themselves. Now I'm not sure I've given satisfactory answers to your questions, but I guess we have to move to the next one because I could talk on and on.
And we would be immensely grateful to listen on and on. But I think we just have one more comment or question now, and then we can perhaps wrap up unless there are others. But is it Jonathan or Jonathan? I'll Jonathan.
Thank you very much. It's Jonathan, yes, Jonathan Kozveli. Thank you. I'm trained in social cultural anthropology, so I cannot help myself but ask the methodological question, because you've told us a lot about these interviews and the snippets of interviews with people who held certain political positions. And I kept wondering, what makes you lead to believe that their articulation of their positions is really what we should take as the cause of them holding this position? In a sense, I kept feeling that you're framing the positions as racist kind of centrates on their belief or prejudice as the kind of cause of the position, rather than as a post factum interpretation or justification of the position. So in a sense, I felt I didn't really kind of learn a lot about these people and the socioeconomic positionality and whether this could play factors. And a lot of scholarship on partisanships kind of focuses on the fact that a lot of people's political positions are not based on empirical claims, but on other factors, affective, identitarian, and so on, right? So I wonder why memory at the center then? And my other question was, your framing of the problems at the center of racism with heritage and ethno-nationalism, I kept thinking of certain decolonial movements who do the same move, who use kind of cultural essentialism and identitarian essentialism and the same kind of claims to heritage to try to actively do decolonization, right? So I kept thinking of your framing of memory, that perhaps the problem lies in these essentialist notions of identities, which allow these kind of groupist interpretations in the first place. So I kept thinking, isn't it that both those far righters then and some of the decolonial activists who slip into this logic kind of keep doing politics that is based on recognition and affirmation, and where is redistribution in all of this? So in a sense, my question is to you, how your focus on memory, is there a place for also a materialist focus in all of it? And do you find a way to connect it in some way? Thank you.
Is there another question or shall I answer?
No,
I think
just those two questions.
Okay, I have to say that I'm trained in cultural anthropology and I have done my field work, but when I started, when I developed my interest for uses of memory and heritage in right-wing populist discourse, I have to be very frank, and I didn't want to do ethnographic work and ethnographic field work with sort of right-wing populist. This is it's a complex kind of fieldwork. There have been a number of ethnographies about doing fieldworks with this particular with communities of people with which you really share very little in terms of your own, you know, sort of your own visions, your own. I didn't want to do it. So what I did is that I tried to find a way to, in a way I was, to have somebody else doing the fieldwork for myself. And this is why I teamed up with this group of sociologists who were carrying out interviews with, a lot of interviews with supporters of populist parties all over Europe. And so what I did, I don't claim to know, I never claimed that I know something about these people's motives. I'm not interested in a way in individual psychology and the reasons why, sort of the reasons why these people came to hold these positions. I'm interested in this case and I'm focusing on the discourse, on the stuff that they say and how they justify sort of the you know, the political choices that they make. So mine is essentially, I don't claim to know anything about why these people vote for certain parties and why these people make certain choices. I only analyze the kind of, the reasoning that they present, that they officially present to, their interviewers about why they believe that certain people should be kicked out, for example. And the other question about the activist, I'm not exactly sure. Can you make, I mean, there are certain, for sure, of course, examples of many examples of, let's call it for the sake of brevity, identity politics on the left. And there has been a lot of writing on issues such as, strategic essentialism, the kind of sort of essentialism of the oppressed, so to speak, that have to come to term somehow with the representations they have been associated with in public. But it don't seem to me now that this is particularly mobilized by the activists that I mentioned in particular. I mean, you can say that Mosulu Di Abanza, he is sort of making a claim about the connection between sort of a cultural heritage artifact and Africa as a whole, which is more and more recognized in international law. So there is also now a legal framework that says that sorry. The university is closing in 15 minutes. So can you make some examples specifically in relation to memory of this activism being essentialist?
Yes, of course. I work here in Göttingen at a project that works with human remains at university collections. And I've been involved in looking at restitutions of different artifacts and human remains. And quite often the essentialization comes when, let's say, 200 years old human remains are then being said to be Namibian, an identity that exists for the past 30 years, maybe, often on basis of both historical records, but also biological measurements. And then there's activists who then I kind of even sympathize with this activism, but it slips down into identitarian essentialist logic and often into also logic that says, well, Herero people should decide upon themselves because, again, kind of identitarian ethnic assumption that ethnicity drives politics. So in a sense, the underlying logic is kind of similar.
I mean, I agree with you in the sense I wouldn't see them as specular, the kind of, let's say, the essentialism of the right-wing populist and I don't think it's so much a matter of, well, right-wing and left-wing, but is about sort of this sort of the populist far right of today and the kind of sort of, let's say, decolonial activists. I think that the question, I mean, I remember particularly also in the US around the debates around Nakba and around, for example, Kennewick Man, and who has the right sort of to claim ancestry. And indeed, that's an extremely tricky way to claim your rights. Yet at the same time, in many ways and in many circumstances, this is the ways in which you can claim sort of your right within a specific legal framework that is built on a set of essentialisms. And this is in a way, this is the trick. And this is the very, the problem of racism that a lot of anti-racist thinkers have been enunciating since the start of critical race theory, is how to enunciate racism without reproducing it. And this is extremely difficult. And at the same time, for example, claim to human remains are also both sort of advanced in the name of you can call it, I mean, I would call it justice to sort of right a historical wrong, and people, a loss of cultural heritage for people for whom it's very important. And at the same time, those claims have to be formulated within sort of a certain kind of legal discourse, which is itself extremely problematic. So in a way, I don't think, just to answer you, I agree with you, but at the same time, I don't think it's exactly the same. It's a bit like Spivak's argument that some people need a little bit of strategic essentialism to be able to make their claim in a public space that allows them to exist only under certain terms, without saying it's flawless and it's politically and sort of unproblematic strategy.
Thank you so much, Chiara. The phrase strategic essentialism was floating about in my mind as well. I think Michael Hertzfeld, whom I know you've collaborated with, uses it in a very different context, but perhaps perhaps that's a point, if not an ending, then at least a pause in our conversation. Regrettably, Zoom has yet to introduce the feature that would allow us to provide drinks and hors d'oeuvres to everyone. I wish that it did have that feature and that we could continue this conversation in a less formal manner, but we'll hope that the pandemic will recede and allow us to do this in the future. Thank you again, Chiara, for your patience with the technical difficulties, and thank you to all of you who've joined us, both for your patience and for your enthusiastic participation. One more round of applause, please, for Chiara. I'm sure that this will stay with all of us. It's clear that these are questions, dilemmas that are at the heart of much political conversation and negotiation these days that have yet to be fully resolved, even perhaps not resolvable. So thank you so much. It's really wonderful to get to know your work better as well. And I wish one and all a pleasant evening, and do stay tuned for further events of this sort. And thank you again, Chiara.